On June 24, 2025, after more than 30 years on Florida's death row, Thomas Lee Gudinas was executed by lethal injection. His death closed a chapter on one of the state's most brutal crimes, a case that stunned Orlando in the spring of 1994. But before we get to his final moments, we need to go back. Back to the night it all began. And to the young woman whose life was stolen forever. It was May 23, 1994, Memorial Day weekend. The streets of downtown Orlando pulsed with energy. Clubs were packed, music poured out of open doors, and young people moved through the humid Florida night like fireflies. Among them was 20-year-old Thomas Gudinas, a restless, heavy-eyed man who shared an apartment with 3 roommates. That evening began the way most of their nights did, with beer and weed. Then, as the buzz set in, they headed out. Their destination, Barbarella's, a popular nightclub known for its booming music and late-night crowd. Inside the club, Thomas and his roommates blended into the chaos. Drinks flowed, music pounded, and people danced until sweat glistened on every forehead. But at some point, Thomas disappeared into the shadows. When the club closed around 3 a.m., he was nowhere to be found. And in the hours that followed, 2 women would cross his path. Only one would survive. Michelle Smith, also known as Rel to her friends, was at the club that night with her fiancé. Around 3 a.m., she was tired and ready to head home. Rel headed to the car. And that's when things turned. At first, she walked through the wrong parking lot, and that's where she saw him. A man crouched low behind a car, watching her. Rel turned quickly and walked faster, trying to shake the feeling that she was being followed. She made it to the right lot, unlocked the door, slid into her car, and hit the lock button. But when she looked up into the rear view mirror, he was there again. The same man, but closer this time. He yanked on the passenger door, trying to force his way in, but it was locked. Then he circled, crouched again, came around to her side, and tried the driver's door, also locked. That's when he snapped. "I want to," he shouted. He then covered his hand with his shirt and started smashing it into her window. Over and over, the glass held, but so did the panic. Rel slammed her hand on the horn. The sound pierced the quiet like a siren, and suddenly the man froze and ran, vanishing into the shadows. But what Rel didn't know was that he didn't run far. He just hid and waited. And just an hour later, he saw his next chance. Not long after, another young woman stepped into the parking lot. Michelle McGrath, 22 years old. A recent college graduate. Bright one love. She was also at Barbarella's that night with her fiancé. Around 4 a.m., she left first to grab the car. When Michelle didn't return, her fiancé began searching. The club, the lot, calling her name. But she was gone. Vanished between a sidewalk and a streetlight. The next morning, Officer Chisari was on bike patrol in downtown Orlando when a man flagged him down. Colbert Presley. He had spotted a pile of clothes and some car keys lying near a parked car, a red Geo Metro. But before the officer could process what that meant, someone nearby screamed. Just a few blocks away, Jane Brand, a school employee, was unlocking the gates to the Pace School when she noticed something strange. A young man sat alone on the school steps. Short brown hair. Baggy shorts. Slouched posture. At first glance, he looked like just another loitering teen. She approached. Told him he couldn't be there. He didn't respond. Just stood up, adjusted the front of his shorts, and slowly climbed over the brick wall behind the school. Jane watched, uneasy, then followed. And what she saw next would haunt her forever. Lying in the dirt behind the school was a young woman, naked, crumpled, lifeless. Her bra was pushed halfway up. Her clothes were gone. It was Michelle McGrath. Jane screamed. Thomas ran. He sprinted back toward the lot where Michelle's car waited, keys still there. He jumped inside the red Geo Metro and sped off. By the time news broke of the body's discovery, Rel went straight to the police. She described the man who tried to attack her in vivid detail. And when they showed her a photo lineup, she didn't hesitate. She picked out Thomas Gudinas. And at trial, she pointed to him again. There was no doubt in her mind that it was him. Jane Brand, the Pace School employee who found Michelle's body, was shown the same lineup. At first, she hesitated, but later, She saw a clip on the news of Thomas walking, and everything clicked. She recognized the same figure she saw on the school grounds that morning. And again, it was Thomas Gudinas. And with this, the police had enough to arrest him. At his apartment, Thomas's roommates had already started noticing things. He didn't come home with them after the club that night, but by the next morning he was back, covered in blood. His hands were torn up, his knuckles scraped raw, and his boxers were soaked in something dark. Blood. When they asked him what happened, Thomas claimed he had gotten into a fight with two African-American men. He was later asked by one of his roommates, half joking, half curious, if Michelle had been a good lay. Thomas smirked and said, "Yeah, and I did it while she was dead." The words stuck in the air like poison. One roommate heard it, then another. The horror deepened. Police searched his apartment. The evidence came in like a tidal wave. Forensic reports revealed Michelle's skull had been crushed, likely stomped with a boot. There were signs she had fought back, bruises, cuts, defensive wounds. But it hadn't been enough. She had been violently violated with broken sticks, one piece jammed 2 inches deep. There was additional trauma, suggesting more than one weapon. Thomas's DNA was found on Michelle's body. His fingerprints were on her car and the school gate. And the red Geo Metro was located abandoned, not far away. But who was Thomas Gudinas? And how did he become capable of such horror? His mother, Karen Goldwaite, tried to explain. She spoke of a pregnancy that nearly broke her and a birth that nearly killed him. And the first 6 months of Thomas's life were a blur of fevers, breathing problems, and endless doctor visits. And then came the rages. By the time he could walk, Thomas had tantrums that could last for hours. He didn't lash out at anyone, not yet. But all the screaming, the shaking, the wild-eyed fury made it clear something was wrong. Doctors diagnosed him as hyperactive and emotionally unstable. Teachers described him as uncontrollable. One recalled him flipping chairs over in the middle of class, saying it was like a fuse inside him snapped anytime something didn't go his way. By the time he was 6, his mother brought him to Boston University for an evaluation. And soon after, she turned to the Massachusetts Division of Youth Services, desperate for help. But what followed was a blur of instability. Over the next several years, Thomas was moved through 105 placements, foster homes, shelters, and group facilities. In all that chaos, Thomas only made it through 4th grade in regular school. He earned a GED later, but his learning struggles were obvious, and he was eventually diagnosed with a low IQ of 85. Thomas started drinking when he was still a kid. Then it was weed, then cocaine. He even tried LSD, all long before he turned 18. At trial, his younger sister told the court what their house was like growing up. Their father once held Thomas's hand over an open flame to punish him for playing with matches. And another time, after he wet the bed, their dad forced him to stand outside half-naked holding a sign that read, "I will not wet the bed." She added that things got better after the divorce. And Thomas even got along with her stepfather. But by then, the damage was already done. The scars were deep. At trial, the forensic evidence spoke louder than any witness ever could. The medical examiner, Dr. Hegert, testified that Michelle McGrath had died from massive head trauma, her skull crushed by what looked like a stomp from a heavy boot. Her brain had swelled, and the hemorrhaging killed her somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. There were signs she fought back. Bruises and cuts on her hands made that clear. But it hadn't been enough. What followed was savage and deliberate. She was assaulted viciously and angrily with broken pieces of a stick. One fragment jammed 2 in deep, and another pushed in even farther. And it didn't end there. The forensic team found signs of additional trauma, pointing to a second object or attack. Thomas's bodily fluids and with them his DNA were found on her, and his fingerprints were discovered on the gate near the alley and inside her car. Then Thomas's roommates testified against him. They had seen him at the club around 1 a.m. But when they headed home later, he was gone. And when he finally returned, he came back with blood on him. A half-baked story and eventually confessions. The jury heard every word. The gruesome details. The childhood trauma. The psychiatric evaluations. And still, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and attempted burglary. 10 of 12 jurors voted for death. On June 16, 1995, Thomas Lee Gudinas was formally sentenced to die by lethal injection. He was also handed 30 years for the attempted assault on Rel and life sentences for other charges. Then began the long wait. 30 years on Florida's death row. 30 years of appeals, court filings, and psychiatric evaluations. His legal team argued he was mentally ill, psychotic, and delusional, that he no longer understood why he was being punished. But the courts weren't convinced. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed the case again in 2025, just weeks before his execution date. They denied the appeal. June 24, 2025. At 4:45 a.m., Thomas woke up in his cell. He had one visitor that day, his mother. There were no final prayers. No spiritual advisor. For his last meal, he requested pepperoni pizza, French fries, and a can of soda. At 6 p.m., Thomas entered the execution chamber wearing a plain white shirt and dark pants. Witnesses watched as he was strapped to the gurney. He looked calm. Healthy. Still. When the curtain rose, he scanned the room slowly. Then, in a voice too soft to be heard, he said a few words, believed to be a prayer. But the microphone was too far. His final statement has never been released. At 6:09, the lethal drugs began to flow. His breathing slowed. He blinked several times, then faded. By 6:13 p.m., Thomas Lee Gudinas was pronounced dead. He was 51 years old. And Michelle McGrath was finally given justice. But justice doesn't undo pain. It doesn't unbreak a mother's heart. It doesn't erase the fear Rel still carries. And it doesn't bring back a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Michelle never made it home that night. And for 3 decades, her family waited for the day Thomas would answer for what he did. That day came. And now the story ends.